Greetings and welcome. Um, Thank you all for joining for the discussion today. My name is Jon Fjeld. I have been teaching entrepreneurship at Fuqua and at Duke since 2004. In 2005, Wes Cohen and I founded a Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation at Fuqua, and I spent 5 years as director of the Innovation and Entrepreneurship Initiative at Duke. Today, I'd like to talk to you about a subject that's been very important to me for the last number of years. I plan to spend about 20 minutes going through some work in this area, and I'll leave about 10 minutes at the end for a discussion and some questions. If you do have any questions or comments, please feel free to put them in the chat at any time. I might even take some during the discussion, but there's a delay. So as soon as a question occurs to you, please do put it in the chat. Let me move to the presentation. I'm going to start by expressing my, acknowledging some colleagues and expressing my deep thanks to a number of people. I first started working on this after a discussion with Tom Byers at Stanford. Tom, this is about 6-7 years ago. Tom had become extremely concerned about the bad reputation that Silicon Valley entrepreneurs were getting. And he realized that many of these people were people he had actually taught at Stanford. And he thought it was time that we do something more significant in the area of embedding ethics in entrepreneurship education. Tom and I started working on this, and I brought my background in studying ethics, my ancient history of being a philosophy professor. We soon brought Laura Dunham, who is now the dean of the business school at the University of St. Thomas, into our small working group. We also collaborated with Kyle Jensen at Yale on a paper in this area in the Harvard Business Review. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge Bill Aulett at MIT, who has been a very, very important and valuable discussant in this. Finally, Rick Larrick at Fuqua, whom many of you may know, is a prominent social psychologist, and he has helped me expand from the realm of ethics to the social psychology. So what you'll see today is kind of work with these colleagues and the perspective that Rick brings to bear. Now, so let's start. Let me just say at the outset, it's not my intention to preach or try to persuade you to follow an ethical path. Rather, I assume you do. And the question is, how do you go about it? So let's assume that you're an entrepreneur and you want to pursue a worthwhile purpose, you want to do the right thing. Moreover, you want to build an organization that consistently does the right thing. I think this is true, that this frame of mind is true of almost all the young entrepreneurs that I work with here at Duke. So the question is, what do you need? How do you go about it? I'm going to suggest that there are two aspects of this. You need a framework, what I call a normative framework for decision making, and you need an understanding of the things that get in the way, the things that prevent otherwise well-intentioned people from doing the right thing. I'm going to talk about each of these briefly. And by the way, briefly is an understatement because there is a lot that I'm glossing over here. So first, the normative framework. This graphic captures at a very simplified level the main perspectives on ethics in the Western tradition. All theories of ethics assume that human action is goal-oriented, that there is a purpose. Where they differ is on what grounds the value judgments, the decisions about what is the right course of action. One school of thought leans on the concept of principles or values. Another thinks that it's the consequences and the evaluation of consequences that is fundamental. And then finally, there is the so-called virtue perspective, which I'll talk a bit about. So let me start at the beginning. The first point I'd make is that all ventures should begin with a purpose. And despite what economic models might say, the purpose is not profit. Profit is a necessary condition for the sustainability of a venture. It's a fuel that enables growth, but it is not the purpose of the venture. The purpose is generally solving an important problem, offering a valuable service. This is the foundation of any entrepreneurial venture. This is the North Star. Values. Think of values as high-level guides to action. They can be expressed as nouns or noun phrases. Think of, well, in my past, IBM's respect for the individual, or they can be expressed as imperatives. Thou shalt not kill. They don't always tell you what to do. They aren't always easy to apply in particular situations, but they function as guides to decision-making at sort of a high level. On this slide, I've illustrated the notion of a statement of values from the Upswing Corporation. This is a company founded by Fuqua grad Melvin Hines, and I love this statement of values. What I find so compelling about these statements is how rich and meaningful they are. You can imagine employees being inspired by and guided by statements like this, so much more powerful than generic statements like integrity or work hard, play hard. So I'll just leave this with you for a second to think about how value statements can express sort of a deep feeling of what should guide our actions in a company. The next dimension is consequences. The concept of consequences have been an important part of moral reasoning for centuries, millennia actually. But the so-called consequentialism is a theory of morality that was originated by Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, and coined the term utilitarianism to describe that. These ideas are foundational in much economic theory. Think utility maximization. And the utilitarian calculus lies at the heart of much social planning policy work, especially when we're talking about the allocation of scarce resources, for example, in healthcare. Of course, entrepreneurs don't need a complicated calculus. What we must do is consider the consequences of our venture, both in the success scenario and in the failure scenario. And we must be willing to take responsibility for those consequences. This raises the question of how far into an uncertain future must one see? We are not omniscient, but we can do our best here. Finally, the concept of virtue. This has seen a resurgence of interest in the last, I'd say, 10, 20 years. It's regaining prominence in discussions of moral reasoning. So-called virtue ethics was first articulated by Aristotle, and my colleagues will be happy to hear me get Aristotle into this talk, and it remains profoundly relevant. The basic idea of virtue ethics is that character is the foundation of moral decisions. Your decisions are grounded in your character, and your character is formed by your actions and decisions. In the business world, which is the context for much of our action these days, this is, I think, a very important idea. For the entrepreneur, as you are shaping the organization, it is shaping you. So, let me summarize the normative framework here, the left-hand side of the summary. 4 basic ideas. Every venture should begin with a purpose that is worthwhile, clear, and compelling. Entrepreneurs should work to understand the consequences of their ventures and be willing to take responsibility. There should be clear values that guide decision-making. And finally, you should keep in mind that as you build the venture, you are shaping the organization and it is shaping you. Now, moving to the psychological factors that can get in the way. Why do otherwise well-intentioned people often fail to do the right thing? Why do organizations, collections of otherwise well-intentioned people, fail to do the right thing and sometimes do terrible harm? We've divided these factors, and again, the summarizing 75 years or so of research in psychology on this, but I've divided it into things that undermine the individual's moral reasoning and things that undermine the organization's moral reasoning. Let me just touch on each of them in turn. The first point, the escalation of commitment, is really the concept of a slippery slope. One small misstep, and then that gets rationalized, and you move on to a bigger one, and pretty soon you've gone much farther down the path of acting in the wrong way than you really intended at the beginning. The second thing is this motivated reasoning, rationalization. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Milgram experiment, the famous Milgram experiment. You wouldn't get away with this research today, but the core of this experiment was he had people administer what they thought to be ever-increasing levels of electric shock to subjects who were eventually screaming in pain. And the thing that kept them going was the so-called teacher in the experiment that kind of kept telling him, keep going, keep going. And so that the yielding of authority to someone and doing things that on the face of it were egregious affects really the majority of us. The next thing is this fairly self-explanatory. People will rationalize things by saying, well, I'm just responsible for my job. I'm not really responsible for the outcome here. And then finally on this column, peer pressure, the influence of the social group we're in, also very powerful. The organization side is a bit more self-explanatory. You can imagine how it's easy to build an organization that is so complex, where things are so chopped up that no one is really responsible for the final outcome. And then secondly, it's possible to put into an organization a set of objectives that drive action and keep the individual's focus on those objectives to the exclusion of broader considerations of what is actually right. So, given our intention to build an organization that ought to exist, and given our framework to guide decision-making, how do we reduce the chances that our team will fall into the traps that I've just outlined? First, I want to emphasize, in fact, the importance of diversity of perspectives in ethical reasoning. It's been well demonstrated that a collection of people with diverse perspectives and perceptions are much more likely to make a good decision than an individual thinking alone. Secondly, the consistency of decision-making, consistent adherence to a set of values, and this is really a critical role for leadership, will imbue the whole organization with a consistent and value-driven action and decision-making. And then finally, you have to ensure that the incentives and the objectives used for performance management are in line with the company purpose and the company values. These are all things that are under control of management and will dramatically increase the probability that the organization will consistently make solid, good decisions. I'll turn briefly to strategies for the individual, and in particular for the entrepreneur. What to do to put yourself on a path that will allow you to consistently do the right thing. First, you have to think about it. You have to anticipate what the challenges are. You have to critically evaluate the situation you're in so that you will put yourself in a position to deliberate about the right course of action. Secondly, rely on experienced advisors that you can trust. This is so easy, and it's surprising how often especially young entrepreneurs don't take advantage of the experience that's available to them. And then finally, this point of reflection, just think about these two questions. As you make decisions for the organization, ask yourself, does this reflect who I am? Is this how I want to be seen by others? That's sometimes a powerful check on what we do. So just to summarize, on the assumption that you want to do the right thing as an entrepreneur and that you want to build an organization to be proud of, building decision-making using the tools in the normative framework and building the organization and acting yourself to inoculate yourself from some of the causes that things go wrong, I think this gives you a good foundation. So let me just talk briefly in the minute that I have left about a couple of examples. Social media. No one thought probably 2001 or 2, Facebook was founded, MySpace a little before that. No one imagined at the time the profound impact that social media would have on society, on politics, on young people in particular. And, from the perspective of many people, the influence is, on balance, possibly not positive. How did we get here? What firms shaped the present, and how were they acting? I'll just leave you with that question. However, think about artificial intelligence. There has been an explosion of interest in this. AI has already proven to have wonderful benefits. In healthcare, for example, medical imaging, decision support, there are many areas where the ability of software to process millions and millions and millions of data points and see patterns that human beings can't see, it's a very, very powerful tool. My mother-in-law doesn't agree, but self-driving, I think, is going to be a dramatic benefit in the area of transportation. At the same time, we have deeply knowledgeable experts warning us that this technology is dangerous and it's taking us to a future that for them is scary. So how will this technology be developed? What innovators and entrepreneurs will guide the evolution of this technology? What goals will they be trying to realize? What values will guide this journey? I'll leave you by saying, or leave the talk by saying, I hope it's some of you, and I hope you've built organizations that are value-driven, where you're taking responsibility for where we're going. So thanks very much. I'll take any questions or any comments that you may have. So let me just read this question. I'm not sure if you can all see it, but Gianluca asks, how does the framework apply to disruptive enterprises that intentionally think it is the right thing to turn the status quo upside down while potentially harming somebody in the process? So wonderful question. And, the poster child for this is Uber, that has intentionally been intended to disrupt the status quo in transportation. I think we can all argue that Uber has been a wonderful innovation in many, many places. Has it been all positive? Well, I would say no. And could it have gotten there? Could this disruption have occurred without some of the negative harms? And to me, the answer is yes. There is no reason for Uber to have pursued a path of breaking things along the way. There is no reason that Uber had to set itself up as an antagonist to established institutions. There is a wonderful value proposition to so many in Uber that it could have gotten to the same place, in my mind, but taken a slightly different path to get there. So thanks for that question. Erica asks, okay. What are some strategies that entrepreneurs can use to navigate situations where there is a conflict between ethical behavior and investor pressures to maximize returns? Erica, that is a wonderful question. And I will say, so there are no blanket generalizations here, but I've worked with many, many investors. And I haven't met any, although I'm sure they're out there, but I don't personally know any who want people to act unethically or want to fund companies that act unethically. I think the trick for an entrepreneur is once you've taken money from an investor, you have a responsibility to try to provide the returns that their limited partners expect. I mean, that's the way this whole machine works. It's not like, I said profit is not the purpose of a venture, but my point here is not that making money is bad or that a solid return on investment is a bad thing. In fact, it's something we should try to achieve, and we are, in a way, we've taken on the responsibility to achieve that. I've done a couple of cases in classes where a very worthwhile venture failed because of bad business strategy. The trick here is to do both, to pursue a good purpose, a worthwhile purpose, and do it the right way, and be a successful business. So, your question is the trade-off between ethical behavior and investor pressures to maximize returns. I would say in general that trade-off doesn't exist. And I think you should certainly work not to put yourself in a position where it seems that you are trading off between these things. Okay. How can businesses avoid the objective decision criteria that seem prevalent in the world of business? Also, excellent question. So first, think about the relationship between the purpose or mission of an organization and objectives. The objectives are a way of translating the endpoint of the journey to the steps we need to take in the near term. So number one, the objectives need to be aligned with the purpose. They need to be taking you toward that purpose. And of course, they need to be consistent with the values that you think are guiding the overall journey. If you think back to the examples I gave of Upswing, in talking to Melvin, these are values that both inspire and guide the employees. So as a manager, as a CEO or founder, you have to ensure that the objectives, you have to think about how the objectives relate to the context in which you're setting those objectives. Okay, that was a few questions. Any other questions? Well, seeing none, let me assume and hope that it's because this has stimulated some thought among a set of prospective entrepreneurs or current entrepreneurs. Let me thank you all for joining me today for this talk. And let me remind you that the next LinkedIn Live is Yuji Wynette on January 8th, and he will be talking about the use of callbacks in marketing.